Hey, everybody. Time for my third and final lecture on Dante's Inferno. Um, what I'm going to do is just talk about a couple important parts of the canto that we had left for you to read. Um, and then I'll just talk a little briefly about how Inferno ends, since you probably noticed in the syllabus, we're not going to be reading all of it. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit and then talk about the final canto, which is obviously the final part of the first part of the Divine Comedy, Inferno, and just so you have a little sense for what happens at the end. Though I think given what's already happened, we have a sense for where the pilgrim wants to be at the end of this journey through hell, so that he can begin the next leg of his trip, right? Which he tried to undertake in the very first canto when he came out of the woods and tried to climb Mount Purgatory and realized he couldn't do it by himself until he went on this journey. There's some really important stuff in Canto 14 that I want to talk about. The pilgrim asked Virgil about the source of the rivers of boiling blood. We've talked about the three: the Archer on the Styx and the Phlegethon, which we learn flow out of Crete. And then there's a pool at the bottom of hell called the Cocytus, where everything moves in that direction to that pool. And then we learn about where it actually comes from, and what actually is the symbolism that's involved with Crete, and very famously known as the Old Man of Crete. I have a couple different images of the Old Man of Crete. There's sort of an more original image here. This one actually is from William Blake, the poet and artist William Blake. Some of you may be familiar with Blake, his art or his poems. And he's going to be describing this old man of Crete. And then there is also a somewhat different kind of representation with the same symbolism of the old man of Crete. And you can see, again, he's made up of these different parts. So I'm just going to read briefly lines 90 through 120 in the canto, and then talk about what's being described here. So again, he's wanting to find out where's this, where are these rivers coming from, etc. These were my master's words, and I at once implored him to provide me with the food for which he had given me the appetite. Right? He wants more details here. And so he says, in the middle of the sea, there lies a wasteland, he immediately began, that's known as Crete, under whose king the world once knew innocence. There's a mountain there that was called Ida, then happy in its verdure and its streams, verdure meaning it was very green, lush, now deserted like an old discarded thing. Rhea chose it once as a safe cradle for her son, which was Jupiter, and to conceal his presence better, she had servants scream loud when he cried. And he actually was trying to conceal him from his father, who was Saturn. In the mountain's core, an ancient man stands tall. He has his shoulders torn toward Demetia, and faces Rome as though it were his mirror. His head is fashioned of the finest gold. Pure silver are his arms and hands and chest. From there to where his legs spread, he is brass. The rest of him is all of chosen iron, except for his right foot, which is terracotta, which is a kind of hardened clay. He puts more weight on this foot than the other. You can kind of see in this picture there, one foot looks different than the other. Every part of him, except the gold, is broken by a fissure, dripping tears down to his feet, where they collect to erode the cavern's rock. From stone to stone, they drain down here, becoming rivers, Archeron, Styx, Phlegethon, then overflow down through this tight canal until they fall to where the all falling ends. They form Cocytus. What that pool is like, I need not tell you. You will see for yourself. So clearly these tears from the old man of Crete are kind of transfigured, I guess, into this blood that makes up these boiling rivers. So that's how it's described in the text. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the symbolism here because it's important. The original old man that has this kind of general description actually comes from Daniel 2 from the Old Testament. So it has biblical roots. Mount Ida on Crete, as was mentioned, Crete was perhaps chosen in part because it was at the time the middle of the known world. So that sort of makes sense to put this old man of Crete there. Mentioned that he has his back to the pagan east towards Egypt, which is obviously intentional, while he faces the Christian west, which the time is identified as Rome. And again, we talked about Rhea protecting her son Jupiter from her husband Saturn, says that her servant screamed when Jupiter cried when he was a baby so that the father wouldn't hear. It might sort of seem strange that Saturn would menace his son Juno, but again, we know from what we've already discussed with mythology, all of the power struggles. We saw an example of the dislike between Venus and her mother Juno, right? One becomes jealous of the other. The one's worried the other one's going to take their power away, etc. So I think this is why we have this sort of this portrayal of Saturn trying to get at Jupiter and Rhea wanting to protect him on Crete. Crete is also the place where Daedalus and his son Icarus tried to escape from. You might remember the story of Icarus and Daedalus, where Icarus, who was Daedalus' son, tried to make these wings out of wax so that they could escape from Crete. But Icarus flew too high, and the wax in his wings melted, and he came sort of crashing down to the earth. It's been argued, or suggested at least, that this is actually where the saying to kill two birds with one stone actually comes from. And that, in fact, in at least one telling of this story, that Icarus, to get the feathers that they needed to make these wings that were held together with wax, he had to knock a bird out of the air. And supposedly with one rock, he managed to kill two birds. They fell to the earth, and therefore they had enough feathers for wings for Icarus and his father. It fits, it seems, that story. You may have heard that saying before. I'm guessing most people have. It's kind of just, it's one of those sayings that people will use, but if you think about it, it's sort of kind of disturbing, makes you wonder where it came from. This is perhaps where that story came from. Icarus is actually mentioned in this, the story of Icarus, a little later in Canto 17, interestingly. So we have this description of this, the old man of Crete, which you can see from this picture. So the head is made of gold, perhaps to represent sort of the golden age, which existed before the fall, right, in the Garden of Eden. So it's a very brief golden age. So it just makes up one part of the old man of Crete, but it is the most important part, right, his head. The upper torso silver, the middle brass, the legs of iron, right? Each of those sort of a less refined, a less valuable kind of metal. Until we come to his feet, and it described that he has one foot that's made out of terracotta. It's been argued that that might represent maybe the corruption of the church. It's mentioned that that foot is heavier. He puts more weight on that foot. Remember, back in Canto 1, actually line 30 from Canto 1, the pilgrim is talking about having to drag his heavier foot behind him. And we mentioned that that was the foot that is holding him to the earth. It represents sort of his earthly commitments, the thing that's holding him down, literally and figuratively, to the earth, his earthly desires, his earthly life, those kind of things that are sort of interfering with his ability to be closer to the divine. And the same thing is mentioned here of the old man of Crete, and there's no doubt that that's intentional. The old man's tears flow through a fissure that runs through his body. It doesn't exist in his head. The head is it doesn't have a crack in it, but the rest of his body has a crack in it. And supposedly his tears then flow through the fissure and eventually form the three rivers of boiling blood that pool at the Cocytus at the bottom of hell. I also mentioned too, it says that Mount Ida was once green, and lots of growth and verdure and very lush. Again, maybe it looks very Edenic. It's almost described as though it was like Edenic, and it now is a wasteland. Some of you might be aware of T.S. Eliot's very famous poem called The Wasteland. It's been argued that maybe one of the inspirations for T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, comes from the wasteland as it's described here, with the situation with Crete after the fall of man. So there's a brief description here of what I had just mentioned about the story of the old man of Crete. Mentions the old man is constructed of descending hierarchy of materials, right? Gold for the head, silver in arms and chest, brass midsection, iron for the rest, except the clay foot. The statue recalls the various ages of mankind or humankind. Although the statue is not itself found in hell, the tears that flow down the crack in its body, at least it's not found at the very bottom of hell, right? But the tears that flow down the crack in its body, only the golden head is whole, represent all the suffering of humanity and thus become the river in hell that goes by the different names according to region, Archeron, Styx, Phlegethon. The suffering of humanity is obviously tied directly to sin and the sinful nature of human beings. So those things are very closely connected here. The idea of sin and the tears of the old man and the suffering of human beings as a result, in large part, of their sinning nature. The idea of having clay feet or feet of clay is something you may have also heard of before. And I think there's a similar sort of source here. Yeah, here's sort of one example of one explanation of this, having feet of clay. To have feet of clay is to have some basic weakness or fault. This idiom is often applied to someone who is admired or is of high repute, but who is discovered to be weak of character or flawed in some way. And we see that that was certainly true of human beings after the fall in the Garden of Eden with original sin, and how that is symbolized in the old man of Crete. And again, the fissure that runs throughout him, the tears running down, etc. So, he was once, we assume, didn't have this this fissure, we can imagine, or maybe was made all of gold. And then original sin happens, and then again we get to different stages of sort of degradation. And there've been other uses for this idea of feet of clay before. There's one here related to the media. The media seems to worship celebrities at the same time as looking for their feet of clay. I mean, in other words, meaning looking for their shortcoming, building them up but wanting to tear them down at the same time. And again, we can see a kind of a rough parallel there with the old man of Crete. So that's where that comes from. Again, it's probably in terms of the symbolism in Dante's Inferno, maybe it's certainly the most elaborate symbol in Dante's Inferno. In some ways, too, the most important, certainly a major lesson here for the pilgrim in how this is described. A couple other things. Line 51 in the pilgrims, again, being interested in the fact that the shades that he's meeting is in hell don't know what's going on sort of in the present, because they're kind of stuck in time in an eternal present that is just their own sort of existence. And there are various references to that. And there's in line 51, there's a quote, "What I once was alive, I still am dead," which I think, captures that idea nicely. And it also suggests that the only person who really is in a position to grow and learn during his time in hell is the pilgrim, right? Since he's not dead, he's not stuck in this eternal present as a shade, as a soul. Um, and so obviously his existence is different than the existence of these shades in hell. And we know that some of the people he's come across have kind of asked him what's going on currently in the world, because they're aren't aware of they're stuck in that eternal present. So what kind of development do we see in the pilgrim? And I had us focus on the issue of pity and his reaction to the suffering he sees, these souls experiencing in hell, and the fact that he moved from seeing these damned souls and pitying them to feeling glee at their suffering. So we have the two extremes there, right? And he eventually has to find that Aristotelian sort of golden mean, to eventually pass to cold judgment. Cold judgment, I think the word cold there is important, right? It suggests reason, logic, right? Cold, something that's hot represents more emotion, passion, right? Desire, those kinds of things. But cold judgment suggests that it's kind of dispassionate reason or logic. And that he has to reach that stage of what I described as a righteous indignation. And we do see him moving in that direction over the course of the Inferno, and achieving a moral and intellectual realization that sin should be unreservedly abhorred, regardless of whose sin it is, and that God's justice is and should be infinitely revered. Right, so we get that sort of dichotomy there. But he does still regress periodically, as it's mentioned in the notes in the Penguin edition to the text, the notes that appear after each canto. Talk about that a little bit, especially when the pilgrim confronts people that he knows and likes or dislikes, right? The people that he likes, that he knows, he tends more towards wanting to feel pity for them, and maybe struggles with that a little bit. The people that he dislikes, and we know most of those are political figures, and also popes that he sees, who used their power and the power of the church to acquire wealth, the selling of indulgences, as it was often termed, right? To get a blessing, baptized, whatever it might be, for money or for other kinds of favors. And that's one of the worst kinds of sins that one can commit for Dante, right? Because you are in the power of being the person who helps to communicate and teach God's words to the people. You're an official in the church, and popes, you're the highest official, right, in the church. Extreme authority and power and responsibility. And it's the worst kind of abuse of power and responsibility to get involved in the sale of indulgences and do other kinds of things for your own personal gain, power, wealth, whatever it might be. And that's something that wasn't very important for Dante. I think he saw the corruption of the church in his own day and of the popes in his own day and time. And it was something that really concerned him. I talked in my first lecture about how he really believed that spiritual matters should be up to the church and temporal or earthly matters should be up to up to politics, and that those two things should be separated. And certainly the church shouldn't meddle in politics. And we've seen that relationship between the church and the political realm, in looking at the history of Rome in particular, and in talking about some of the tension that would develop over time between the church um, and the Roman Empire, or was it at times called the Holy Roman Empire, um, as it started to fall apart, and the invasions from the east, right, brought different kind of religious perspectives, etc. We had these Arian Ostrogoths, right, who didn't believe that Jesus was actually, God's son and the Savior. So all of these things become mixed up in the politics, sort of the day in the Roman Empire, and and lead to and are a reflection of all kinds of corruption that Dante finds obviously very problematic. Um, so in some sense, I think it's pretty clear for Dante that the thing that he sees that seems to be the worst kind of sin for him are sins against God, obviously, and sins against the church. So then we get to Canto 16, and I'm just going to read a brief section of Canto 16 to you, and then we'll jump to the end of the Inferno, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens at the end since we're not going to be reading all the way through. So Dante writes, so down a single rocky precipice we found the tainted waters falling, roaring sound loud enough to deafen us in seconds, right? All this water's going down to the bottom of hell from these three rivers, Tupul and Cocytus. And the pilgrim says, I wore a cord that fastened round my waist, with which I had once thought I might be able to catch the leopard with the gaudy skin. That's a reference back to Canto number 1 when he saw those three animals, representing, again, another corruption of the Trinity. We saw the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf. We've heard a little bit more about them since. And so he's sort of telling us that he had thought that, remember, he could defeat the animals by himself, realized he finally couldn't, and Virgil explains all of this to him, but that he thought that he might be able to use that cord fastened around his waist to catch the leopard. As soon as I removed it from my body, just as my guide commanded me to do, referring to Virgil, I gave it to him looped into a coil. Then taking it and turning to the right, he flung it quite a distance past the bank and down into the deepness of the pit. And again, that's from Canto 16. So again, the symbolism here is really important, right? The cord, it's been argued, really represents the pilgrim's self-confidence, maybe initial self-confidence, thinking he could defeat the leopard himself, which again, if we think about this symbolically, which makes him think he can, without help and without this education he has to undergo, defeat his sinful nature, get himself back on the righteous path again, and to be able to do it himself, without needing help. And also a kind of a conceit, I think at the same time. So that kind of self-confidence in that conceit, and that's obviously the fact that he thought he could catch the leopard by himself reflects that. So Virgil, kind of representing divine reason, kind of frees the pilgrim from his conceit, which is very foolish, and his self-confidence. And he's finally at the point that he's maybe ready to get rid of this cord, about halfway through his journey here. And has really gotten to the point that he understands that why and how all of this is necessary for him to again get back on the righteous path and to be able to do what he wants to be able to, which ultimately is to come closer to the divine, and obviously, to be saved. The pilgrim will later gird himself, put around his waist as kind of something that protects him, and is kind of steels him against dangers that he might face. He girds himself with a reed, which kind of symbolizes humility, right? He goes from this cord that he wore originally, which maybe was made of some kind of nice material, etc., right, to having just a reed around his waist. And again, we can see how that would symbolize humility. And that he puts that around his waist in order to climb Mount Purgatory, right? Which is the next part of the Divine Comedy. When he's able to finally undertake what he wanted to do from the very beginning. If we then jump to the end, which is Canto 34, he finally meets up with Lucifer at the bottom of hell, which remember is at the very interior of the earth, right at the earth's core, the farthest place from God. And there's some different portrayals, again, of what this might look like. This is maybe the most famous of them. And he's described as chewing on 3 different individuals that again represent another perversion of the Trinity. And as it's described, as Lucifer had his fall from heaven and fell down into the earth, he fell head first and burrowed into he fell so far and so hard, he burrowed into the center of the earth. And his head pushed up this earth that created Mount Purgatory. And then his legs ended up creating this big opening that is the entrance to hell, and the outer larger part of this kind of spiral that is described. In the middle here, we can see Virgil on the pilgrim. And this should actually be upside down. Remember the original drawing, Jerusalem was at the top of the earth and Mount Purgatory was at the bottom. And so Lucifer falls all the way down through the earth, and to get to Mount Purgatory, to make that other half of their climb from the center of the earth to what's typically portrayed as the bottom of the earth, they actually have to climb up Lucifer, which sounds like it was probably a whole lot of fun. So this is actually upside down from the way ultimately it's described in the book and sort of portrayed, because Lucifer fell head first. Here's another artist rendering of the same thing. Again, you can see him chewing on these 3 people who were the 3 worst sinners. And here again, we have Virgil and the pilgrim climbing up Lucifer. And again, it should be reversed here, because they're actually climbing down towards the bottom of the earth to make it back to Mount Purgatory, so that again the pilgrim can begin his next part of the journey. The 3 worst sinners of all time are people who betrayed their benefactors, and they are described as Judas Iscariot and Brutus and Cassius, and those are the people that are being endlessly tortured by being chomped upon by Lucifer. As they finish their climb and make it back to the surface of the earth again, they finally again are capable of seeing the sun and the stars, right? Darkness always represents, ignorance. In this case, that ignorance represents sinfulness, and just the way in which sin is sort of described. Just like the dark woods where the pilgrim found himself lost at the beginning, that he finally thought he made his way out of to climb Mount Purgatory. And the sun typically in light represents enlightenment, right? So there's very similar symbolism here to Plato's allegory of the cave, which we also saw Boethius using in the Consolation of Philosophy, very directly drawing that from Plato's cave allegory. And so the symbolism here is very similar, obviously. So now the journey the pilgrim will take is upward toward the divine realm, which is typically in the nighttime sky signaled by the stars. and we know that he will be joined by, by Beatrice, um, and be able to undertake the next leg of his journey. Now, again, this is called the Divine Comedy, this whole series. And remember that I mentioned comedy is not because it's funny, certainly not haha funny, but because it has a happy ending. So this is really the dark part of the Divine Comedy, right? Inferno. The tone of the writing, what is encountered, how it's encountered, the experience the pilgrim has is obviously going to be very different as we move forward from here. So again, I hope you found that helpful. We're going to be moving on towards, I believe, next Moore's Utopia. And I'll put a lecture together and talk a little bit about who Moore was, how to read Utopia, etc. Another very famous text that's often referenced, and was probably after Plato's Republic, the first text that was really becomes a formal part of utopian literature, and also dystopian literature as it's developed, right? The opposite of utopia, dystopia. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So again, I hope you found that helpful, and I'll see you again next time.